What you're about to watch is a story of greed, supernatural revenge, and a price no man should ever have to pay. The shrill sound of a scream shattered the midnight silence. Sandra bolted upright in bed, her heart pounding against her ribs as she turned to find her husband, Patrick, sitting beside her. His body trembled violently, sweat glistening on his skin in the dim moonlight. His eyes, wide with terror, stared down at his lap as if witnessing something incomprehensible. "Patrick, what's wrong?" Sandra's voice quivered as she reached out to touch his shoulder. He didn't respond immediately, only pointing downward with a shaking hand, his lips moving but no words emerging. The fear in his eyes sent chills down her spine. Panic rising in her chest, Sandra pulled back the sheets. What she saw, or rather what she didn't see, made her own scream pierce the night. Her husband's manhood was gone, not injured, not disfigured, but completely absent, as if it had never existed. The skin was smooth, showing no signs of trauma or surgery. What is this?" Sandra clutched her chest, struggling to breathe as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. Patrick shook his head violently, his voice finally breaking through in a trembling whisper. "I don't know, Sandra. I don't know. I woke up and it was gone." Sandra's mind raced through possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. With trembling fingers, she grabbed her phone from the nightstand and dialed for an ambulance. The wait felt eternal, each minute stretching like hours as Patrick sat motionless, still staring down in disbelief. When they arrived at the hospital, the emergency room burst into activity. Doctors and nurses surrounded Patrick, their initial concern giving way to confusion as they examined him. Dr. Uchi, the lead physician, stood back with a perplexed expression that did nothing to ease Sandra's fears. "I've never seen anything like this before," he admitted to his team, his voice low but clear enough for Sandra to hear. "His external genitalia is completely absent." "Absent?" Sandra's voice cracked. "What do you mean? Is it hidden? Injured?" Dr. Yuchi shook his head, his professional demeanor barely masking his bewilderment. "Mrs. Patrick, there's no injury, no trauma at all. It's as if it was never there." From the examination table, Patrick's voice rose in desperation. "Doctor, fix me. I don't care how, just fix this. Please." The doctor assured them they would do their best, but his uncertainty was evident in his eyes. As specialists were called in and tests were ordered, Sandra stood by her husband's side, holding his hand. She watched as each medical professional who examined Patrick left with the same baffled expression. This was unprecedented, they all said. There was no medical explanation for what they were seeing. As the night wore on and the hospital corridors grew quiet, Sandra couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than what met the eye. Something unnatural had happened to her husband, something that defied medical science. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of a nightmare that would unravel their lives in ways she could never have imagined. 2 months before the nightmare began, Patrick strutted through the bustling streets of Port Harcourt, exuding the confidence of a man who had everything going for him. At 35, he was the embodiment of success: designer suits, a luxury car, and a string of profitable business deals that kept his bank account flush with cash. His polished appearance and charismatic smile opened doors that remained firmly closed to others. Back in Lagos, a beautiful home awaited him, where his wife Sandra and their young son lived. Their marriage of 5 years had been a picture of domestic bliss, at least on the surface. Sandra was the perfect wife, supportive, elegant, and devoted to raising their 3-year-old son. Patrick's friends often envied his seemingly perfect life, though few knew the restlessness that lurked beneath his composed exterior. Port Harcourt had become his second home due to an extended business project that required him to stay for 2 months. The coastal city, with its vibrant nightlife and bustling oil economy, offered Patrick a taste of freedom from his family responsibilities. Here, he could be whoever he wanted to be, far from the watchful eyes of Lagos society. During the day, Patrick commanded respect in business meetings, negotiating deals with the confidence of someone who knew their worth. His reputation preceded him in corporate circles. He was known as the man who could close any deal, charm any client. The same drive that made him successful in business spilled over into his personal life, where he viewed every conquest as another notch in his belt. His temporary apartment in Port Harcourt's affluent Grot area became a regular gathering spot for his local friends, mostly successful bachelors who shared his taste for the finer things in life. They would spend evenings drinking premium whiskey, sharing stories of their exploits and planning their next adventures. Patrick relished these moments of male camaraderie, so different from his structured life in Lagos. When calls came from Sandra, he would step away, switching effortlessly into the role of devoted husband and father. He would ask about their son's latest achievements, promise to bring back gifts, and assure Sandra of his love. But after hanging up, he would rejoin his friends, slipping back into the skin of the confident businessman who could have anything or anyone he desired. Little did Patrick know that his comfortable double life was about to be challenged. The city of Port Harcourt held secrets he couldn't imagine, and his pride was about to lead him down a path that would shatter everything he had built. As he sat with his friends that fateful evening, nursing an expensive drink and laughing at their stories, he had no idea that his next conquest would be his last and that the price of his arrogance would be higher than he could ever imagine. The stage was set for a tale of desire, deception, and supernatural retribution that would transform Patrick's life from a story of success into a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked pride and betrayal. The atmosphere in the crowded bar shifted suddenly, as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. Conversations died mid-sentence, and heads turned toward the entrance. Patrick looked up from his drink, curious about what could command such attention in a city known for its beautiful women. That's when he first saw Annabel. She moved through the crowd with ethereal grace, her caramel skin glowing under the dim lights. Her hazel eyes, sharp and mysterious, seemed to pierce through into anyone dared to hold her gaze too long. She wore elegance like a second skin, her presence commanding attention without seeking it. "That's her," Tayan whispered, nudging Patrick's arm. "Annabel, the goddess of Port Harcourt." Patrick raised an eyebrow, amused by his friend's reverent tone. "Goddess? She's just another woman." Chima, another friend at their table, leaned forward with an unusual seriousness. "You don't understand, Patrick. She's different. Every man in the city has tried to get close to her, politicians, oil moguls, even princes. She turns them all away like they're nothing." Patrick watched as Annabel settled at the bar, gracefully declining yet another hopeful admirer's attempt to buy her a drink. Her rejection was polite but firm, leaving no room for negotiation. The man slunk away, joining the long list of those who had tried and failed. "Out of my league," Patrick scoffed, his pride prickling at his friend's doubting looks. "You seem to forget who I am. I've conquered women more beautiful than her. Remember the minister's daughter?" Tayon and Chima exchanged knowing glances. "Prove it then," Chima challenged, a sly smile playing on his lips. "If you can get Annabel, 5 of us will each give you 1 million naira. But if you fail, you owe us 5 million. Patrick's eyes lit up at the challenge. Money wasn't the real prize, it was the thrill of conquering the unconquerable, of proving himself the exception to Annabel's rule of rejection. He took another sip of his whiskey, studying his target with calculated interest. 5 million? You're really underestimating me, he smirked, already plotting his approach. "It's not about you," Patrick Tion warned, his voice unusually serious. "It's about her. She's different. There's something about her that's not quite normal." But Patrick wasn't listening anymore. His mind was already racing with strategies, planning how to break through Annabel's famous defenses. The bet had awakened something in him, a hunter's instinct that wouldn't rest until he had his prize. "Different or not, she's just a woman," he declared, standing up. "Consider your money as good as gone." As Patrick straightened his designer jacket, preparing to make his first move, he failed to notice the knowing smile that briefly crossed Annabel's lips, as if she had been waiting for this moment all along. The game was about to begin, but the rules were nothing like what Patrick imagined. Like a skilled chess player, Patrick orchestrated his pursuit of Annabel with meticulous precision. He spent days studying her routines, the supermarket she frequented on Wednesday mornings, the cafe where she enjoyed solitary lunches, even the church she attended on Sundays. Each detail became a piece in his elaborate game of seduction. His first move came at the supermarket. Seeing Annabel struggling to reach a jar on the top shelf, Patrick seized his moment. "Allow me," he offered smoothly, reaching past her to retrieve it. Their first interaction was brief, just a smile and a thank you from her, but it was enough to plant the seed. From there, Patrick crafted a series of seemingly chance encounters. A flat tire in the parking lot where he happened to be passing by, a bottle of champagne sent to her table at the cafe, stepping in gallantly when another man was bothering her at a bar. Each interaction was calculated, yet appeared perfectly spontaneous. The lies flowed easily from his lips, each one crafted to paint himself as the perfect catch. "I've been so focused on my career," he would tell her, conveniently omitting any mention of his wife and child. "But now I'm ready to find something real." His wedding ring stayed hidden in his hotel room safe, along with his conscience. Slowly, Annabelle's famous resistance began to crack. Their conversations grew longer, more intimate. She laughed at his jokes, shared stories about her life, and began to seek out his company. Patrick played the role of the perfect gentleman, attentive, charming, and seemingly genuine in his pursuit of her heart. When Annabelle finally invited him to her home for dinner, Patrick felt victory within his grasp. Her house was a small but elegant bungalow, every detail as carefully curated as her public image. Over a meal she had prepared herself, she opened up to him in ways she never had before. "You're different from other men," she said softly, her hazel eyes studying him intently. "You're genuine." The irony of her words should have worried him, but Patrick was too focused on his impending triumph to notice the subtle warning in her gaze. Their relationship turned physical that night, an encounter that left Patrick feeling strangely dizzy with success and something else he couldn't quite name. When he showed his friends the photo of them together, proof of his conquest, they were stunned into silence before reluctantly transferring the promised 5 million naira. "I told you," Patrick boasted, already planning his exit strategy. "There's no woman I can't have." But as he prepared to return to Lagos, to his unsuspecting wife and the life he'd temporarily abandoned, Patrick failed to notice the knowing look in Annabelle's eyes when he promised to return soon to discuss their future. She smiled and kissed him goodbye, a smile that held secrets far darker than Patrick could imagine. His victory celebration would be short-lived, for he had no idea that in winning this game he had actually lost everything. The flight back to Lagos felt like any other for Patrick. He was in high spirits, 5 million naira richer, and flushed with the success of his conquest. As the plane descended through the clouds, he mentally packed away his Port Harcourt adventures, ready to step back into his role as devoted husband and father. Sandra greeted him at the airport with their young son, her face glowing with love and trust. Patrick embraced them both, ignoring the slight twinge of guilt that pricked at his conscience. By dinner time, he had fully settled back into domestic life, listening to Sandra's stories about what he'd missed and watching his son play with the toys he'd brought back. That night, as he lay beside his sleeping wife, Patrick felt an unusual heaviness creep through his body. He dismissed it as travel fatigue and drifted off to sleep. But when he woke hours later, his world shattered with a single horrifying discovery. His manhood, the very instrument of his pride and betrayal, had vanished without a trace. The emergency room became a parade of baffled medical professionals. Each specialist who examined him left more confused than the last. X-rays showed nothing unusual. Mirrors revealed no abnormalities. Blood tests came back normal. Yet the reality was undeniable. Where his manhood should have been, there was only smooth, unmarked skin. "In my 30 years of practice," Dr. Uchi confessed, shaking his head, "I've never seen anything like this. There's no medical explanation for what we're seeing." As days turned into weeks, Patrick's condition worsened. The doctors had to insert tubes into his body for basic functions, and complications began to mount. His robust frame started to waste away, his once confident demeanor replaced by a haunted look that grew deeper with each passing day. Sandra watched helplessly as her husband transformed into a shadow of himself. Whenever she tried to question him about what might have caused this mysterious affliction, he would turn away, his eyes filled with a terror he couldn't or wouldn't explain. "Stop asking me," he would snap, his voice trembling. "I don't know anything." But he did know. Every night as he lay in his hospital bed, memories of Annabelle haunted him. He remembered her final words, spoken so softly yet carrying such weight. "Remember me when you're with her." At the time, he dismissed it as the typical sentiment of a woman he was leaving behind. Now, those words echoed in his mind like a death knell. The 5 million naira from his bed quickly dwindled away on medical bills and experimental treatments. Nothing helped. Each day brought new complications, new mysteries that science couldn't explain. Patrick's body was failing him in ways that defied medical knowledge, as if some supernatural force was slowly draining his life force. In his more lucid moments, Patrick knew exactly what was happening to him. This was no medical condition, this was retribution. He had played a dangerous game with someone or something far beyond his understanding, and now he was paying the price. 1 week into his hospitalization, Patrick fell into a fevered sleep that would reveal the terrifying truth behind his affliction. In his dream, he found himself standing before a massive mansion that seemed to pulse with ancient power. The door creaked open on its own, and there stood Annabel, as beautiful as ever, but her eyes now held an otherworldly coldness that made his blood freeze. "Come, Patrick," she called, her voice echoing unnaturally through the air. Despite his desire to run, Patrick's legs moved forward of their own accord, drawn by an invisible force. Inside the mansion, the air grew thick and cold. As he watched, Annabel's form began to change. Her youthful appearance melted away, revealing something far more ancient. She sat upon a grand throne, now wearing a flowing white gown and a golden crown that seemed to emit its own light. Her face, though still beautiful, was etched with centuries of wisdom and power. Suddenly, beautiful women materialized from thin air, surrounding them and chanting in unison, "Queen Mother of the Sea! Queen Mother of the Sea!" "Patrick, Patrick," Annabel's voice cut through the chanting, sharp and mocking. "The king of the ladies, my son-to-be husband. You thought you could use me and run off to your pitiful wife with your ill-gotten millions." Patrick fell to his knees, terror gripping his heart as Annabel rose from her throne. "Let me introduce myself properly. I am Queen Annabel, the Queen Mother of the Daughters of the Sea. I have walked this earth for 250 years, Patrick. 250 years. She bent down, her face inches from his. "Do you know what that means? I have met thousands of men like you, greedy, arrogant, foolish men who think they can take from me and disappear." With a snap of her fingers, a glowing glass appeared, floating in the air. Patrick's eyes widened in horror as he saw his manhood suspended inside it, like a trophy of her victory. "Yes, Patrick," she smiled coldly. "I have it right here. And as long as I have it, no one can save you, not your wife, not your doctors." "Please," Patrick begged, tears streaming down his face. "I'll do anything. Just give it back to me." Annabel studied him with ancient eyes. "Anything? How many men have said those exact words to me? But very well, I will give you one chance at redemption. Serve me for 7 years, Patrick. 7 years of complete loyalty. No lies, no betrayal, no distractions. If you succeed, I might consider returning what you've lost." Patrick's mind raced. 7 years away from his family? But what choice did he have? I agree," he whispered. Good Annabel smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Remember, Patrick, the sea is vast and merciless. Betray me again, and it will swallow you whole." As the dream faded and Patrick jerked awake in his hospital bed, the horror of his situation crashed over him. He had made a deal with something ancient and powerful, and there was no escaping the consequences of his actions. Desperation drove Sandra to confide in her best friend Rita, a deeply religious woman known for always having a scripture ready for life's challenges. As Sandra poured out her fears about Patrick's mysterious condition and his increasingly erratic behavior, Rita listened with growing concern. "Sandra, dear," Rita said gently, clutching her friend's trembling hands, "this isn't just physical. There's something spiritual happening here. I know someone who might be able to help Pastor Emmanuel." The pastor's office was modest but carried an atmosphere of quiet authority. As Sandra recounted the bizarre events of the past weeks, Pastor Emmanuel's expression grew increasingly grave. "This is not an ordinary affliction," he declared, his voice deep and certain. "Your husband is hiding something serious. Until he confesses, no amount of prayer or medical intervention will save him." Armed with this insight, Sandra returned to the hospital where Patrick lay, growing weaker by the day. His once robust frame had withered, his eyes haunted by secrets he refused to share. "Patrick, I went to see a pastor today," she began cautiously. The effect was immediate. Patrick's head snapped toward her, fear blazing in his eyes. "Why would you do that?" he demanded, his voice cracking with panic. "Because I'm worried about you. The doctors don't know what's wrong, and you're getting worse by the day. The pastor said you need to confess whatever you're hiding." But Patrick turned away, his silence a wall between them. Days passed, and his condition deteriorated further. In a final attempt to save him, Sandra brought Pastor Emmanuel to the hospital room. "Patrick," the pastor's voice filled the small room, "I am here to help you, but you must meet me halfway. Whatever you are hiding, You must confess it now." Patrick turned his head slowly, his eyes wide with terror. "You don't understand," he whispered. "If I tell you, she will kill me." "Who?" Patrick, Sandra pleaded. "Who are you talking about?" Before he could answer, a cold wind suddenly swept through the room, extinguishing the candles the pastor had lit for prayer. Patrick's body stiffened, his eyes widening in absolute terror. "She's here," he gasped. She. His body began to convulse violently. Sandra screamed, clutching the pastor's arm as Patrick's face contorted in agony. "Patrick," she cried out. "Patrick, no." But it was too late. As quickly as the convulsions had started, they stopped. Patrick's body fell still, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. Pastor Emmanuel stood beside the bed, his face grim. "The battle was too much for him," he said softly. The forces he was up against were powerful, but his silence gave them strength. Sandra collapsed to the floor, her sobs echoing through the hospital corridors. If only he had spoken up, perhaps he could have been saved. But Patrick had taken his secrets to the grave, leaving behind a mystery that would haunt those who loved him forever.